Welcome to Track 1, The Big Picture. You will be seeing targeted intrusion remediation, lessons from the front lines, presented by Jim Aldridge.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for choosing to come to this talk. If you're like me, you probably you might Google some of the names of the presenters trying to figure out which talks you're going to go to. So number one hit in Google for Jim Aldridge is actually this gentleman, the legendary Arkansas entertainer, singer, and musician. So if you came to see him, you're in the wrong spot. This talk's titled Targeted Intrusion Remediation, Lessons from the Front Lines. My name's Jim Aldridge. I'm a manager with Mandiant. I focus on incident response, both from an investigation perspective and helping our clients remediate intrusions. I primarily focus on targeted intrusions, both advanced persistent threat and state-sponsored adversaries, as well as the organized crime type groups that target financial institutions. Everything in this presentation is based on information in non-classified environments. I don't work in classified environments. I did want to point out, though, if any of you saw Sean Henry's keynote yesterday where he mentioned that he said that something like 90% of the attacks are quote-unquote below the waterline in the classified realm. I would want to add to that. I don't have any experience in the classified realm, but the nation-state-sponsored adversaries that are targeting, that he was probably referring to in that statement, are very much also targeting the corporate world. And a lot of the investigations that I work on are these state-sponsored groups, and they're very much below the waterline, but not in the classified world. So don't just think this is a problem for the defense industrial base or for the government. This is very much a problem for private industry as well. So in this talk, I have three main areas that I want to cover. The first, I'd like to explain what do I mean by targeted persistent threat, and explain to you why I feel that we need a new approach to dealing with these threats from a remediation perspective. Second, I want to walk you through the targeted attack life cycle. So there's 8 phases that, in my experience, are common to targeted attacks. I want to walk you through those. It's an instructional model. It's not intended to say that absolutely every attack is going to have these. And then in the third component, I want to talk about the approach that I've seen be successful, the approach that I've used with my clients to remediate these types of threats. My challenge to you as audience members in today's presentation is to think critically about the life cycle that I'm presenting in this process that I'm going to talk about, and think about what would your organization do if you were faced with a targeted intrusion and this happened to you. Think of 3 things that you want to take away from this presentation. Take a note and go back to your organization if you work internal for a company, or to take back to your clients if you are a security consultant in the consulting field. Because the time to prepare for a targeted intrusion, or really for any intrusion, is now. It's not when you're under the gun, working 70 hours a week, working weekends, and your life is generally in a not very pleasant time. A few words about the threat landscape before we move on, and I wanted to make the point here that, of course, you have your targeted threats and your non-targeted threats. Not all targeted threats are necessarily persistent threats, and the approach that I'm going to talk about and outline in this presentation really applies primarily to targeted persistent threats. Example of this, I want to really focus, when I say targeted persistent threats, think spies, so sponsored by Foreign Intelligence Service or corporate spies, and not targeted attack groups such as those run by organized crime. So the folks that are targeting financial institutions, they're targeted, so they chose your bank or whatever institution for a reason, but they typically don't care about staying around. So they want to get something they can monetize, they want to get the credit card numbers, they want to pump up the accounts, generate debit cards, and then they want to move on. Versus the folks that are bent on espionage, those type of intruders really are looking to maintain access to the environment a long time. Another important distinction here is that these are all who's, not what's. So these are all humans that I'm basically talking about on the other side, not malware. So next I want to talk about what does it mean to be a targeted persistent threat. So from the perspective of targeted, these are folks that are on a mission. They have defined objectives. They do this for a living. They have tradecraft. Some individuals may be more sophisticated than others. Different groups have different techniques in their tool bag. They may have different malware. They may have different tools. These are adversaries that are going to take the time to perform reconnaissance on your organization, and they're going to understand your business to the extent that they need to figure out where that data is probably located that they're after. They're going to take the time to understand where that might be. If they're going to conduct a phishing campaign, they're going to get an understanding of who can they phish that's going to optimize their chances for success. So I'm talking targeted persistent threats, not necessarily the advanced persistent threat, which is one type of targeted threat. So I'm going to be a little bit more general in this talk. Persistent, and here I'm adopting from my colleague Richard Baitlick's definition of advanced persistent threat. Persistent means that that the adversary is going to maintain access to your environment in the long term. So they've been tasked to obtain the latest plans for your widget. And not only do they want the plans on how to build it, they want to understand how to maintain the widget when it's in production. They want to understand how to fix it when it's broken. They want to understand the full life cycle because they want to steal this information and they want it to be actionable. And probably sometime in the future, they're going to get a request through their intelligence apparatus that they need more information. So they're going to need to be able to get back in easily. Also, persistent typically means, to me, quiet. So these are not adversaries that are generally going to be spraying thousands of systems with malware in your environment because they realize that increases their chances of getting caught. So to give you some numbers to put this in perspective, one organization that I worked with recently, a global 100 organization, they had over 100,000 systems in their environment, and they had about 30 total infected systems where the adversary had actually placed backdoors on systems. Threat. Most important thing to keep in mind, and I'll keep hammering at this throughout the presentation, is that this is a human adversary. They're a thinking human being on the other side of the keyboard, and that it's not a tool. The tool is not the threat. A lot of times when I'm out there doing incident response, working with different security teams, I hear that, oh, well, what is the malware doing? Or basically they're talking about the malware as if it's the threat. But the malware is really only a tool that's in the tool bag of the attacker, and it's really just a means to the end of helping them get into your network. So I've talked a little bit about how I define targeted persistent threats, and next I want to talk about what makes them different and why this different approach is needed. When I first learned incident response, I think I did my first incident response engagement probably 7, 8 years ago, and the way I learned it, when you had an infected system, you pulled it offline. You pulled it offline, you did your analysis, and basically it was a strategy of immediate containment. And I have this quote from NIST publication 861, not to bash this publication because I think it's still relevant and the overall process that they define for incident response is still relevant today, but I wanted to highlight this wording of, so when an incident has been detected and analyzed, it is important to contain it before the spread of the incident overwhelms resources. Now, if you're an organization that's dealt with targeted threats before and you have a security intelligence team / security operations center, you've instrumented your environment, you know what's going on, you have good visibility, then when you see a compromised system pop up, by all means, kill it. But if you're an organization that has not dealt with this problem before, you don't have that instrumentation, and you have no idea generally what's going on in the dark corners of your network, at the point that you're thinking about containing something, in my experience, the spread of the quote-unquote incident has already surpassed your ability to deal with it. So executing this type of approach, and I've seen this out there, you pull the systems and it leads to this whack-a-mole situation where you're forever behind the attacker, you're finding a system, you're pulling it offline, he's got 10 other systems that he has backdoors on, and you can never get ahead of him and you're still exposed. So ultimately, I argue that pursuing this sort of this approach is going to prolong your exposure and ultimately prolong risk. So this example, I distilled, tried to remove all potential complexities to really highlight my point in why pulling systems offline, if there's a targeted persistent threat in your environment, is a bad idea. Many of the organizations that I work with that have been targeted by these sorts of threats, the first way they find out about it is by notification from a third party, typically government, and in the United States, typically the FBI will notify them. And in the course of some investigations they're doing, they came upon some information. Knock, knock, knock. Hey, you guys are compromised. Let's keep this simple. And so you have one PC that's infected. It's a type A backdoor, let's call it poison ivy, remote access Trojan, and it's communicating with the command and control server at the domain toocool.3322.org. That's what the FBI tells you. And unknown to you, because your visibility with regard to this threat is probably not what it could be if this is your first time around the block with this type of threat, you also have an infected second PC. Call it PC2, and it's infected with, let's say, Ghost Rat, and it's communicating with a different domain, ur.isachef.com. So it's different command and control infrastructure. And then for good measure, you've got a third system that's compromised. It's a web server, and it's got a web shell. It's a last-ditch ace in the hole for the attacker to be able to get back in the environment. So these are all things we've seen in investigations in the last couple of months. So you clean system one. So you look for the poison ivy in your environment. You don't find it anywhere else. Great. Say you've even got some logs to look at, which I probably wouldn't bet on going into this, but you're able to look at DNS logs and say, all right, nobody's been resolving toocool.332.org. Cool, we're good. So we're going to clean PC1. At this point, you have to think about this as a game of chess. So you've telegraphed to the attacker now that you know about this compromised system. You know about the poison ivy backdoor. You know about toocool.332.org. And meanwhile, the attacker still has access to your environment because they have the Ghost Rat and they have the web shell. If the attacker's been in your environment for any length of time, it's likely, perhaps probable, that they've also moved on to laterally in your environment and gained domain administrator, enterprise admin, privileged access to at least to the Windows environment, which is where they typically start to operate just because that's what's widely deployed in the end user environments. And so if they're able to get back in, they're immediately able to use those passwords and move laterally. And so at this point, you've cleaned PC1, you're confident you don't have any more poison ivy in your environment, and mission accomplished. So we're good. Meanwhile, the attacker's still stealing data in your environment and working hard to do what they're going to do with that data to put you out of business potentially. So the remaining two components of this presentation, I want to next go over the targeted attack lifecycle and then present a case study to provide you some specific details on how this actually unfolds. This is basically a scaled-down version of the information that I use when we kick off incident response engagements with my clients. And this target attack lifecycle and the case study that I'm going to go through, I think, is really helpful, especially for folks in this room that are security professionals, but you maybe haven't dealt with a targeted threat before. So I think when you see exactly what it is that they're doing, you'll start thinking about the right kind of countermeasures. And then the third component is I want to talk about my recommended approach and give some details on some of the specific actions that my clients are finding to be successful to deal with this problem. So the attack lifecycle that is common to most targeted attacks, it includes these 8 phases, from the initial recon and initial compromise, which a lot of times is spear phishing email, but could be some sort of other vulnerability that's exploited. Establishing a foothold, escalating their privileges, and then entering into this loop of activity where they've got a toehold in your environment, they perform internal recon, they move laterally, and they take steps to maintain a presence to make sure that, like on my last example, if you eliminate compromised systems with one of the tools that they use, you haven't gotten them all because they want to maintain access. And then at some point, they complete the mission. And if you think about this, this is one intrusion. If you picture a whole bunch of these little snail guys going off into space, that could be a campaign, and you can start to do some intelligence analysis on things over time. So in this next example, there's a couple of actors that I need to introduce. So there's Company A, a mid-sized global manufacturer. They manufacture a widget. The adversary wants everything to do with this widget. Supplier B happens to be Company B happens to be a supplier to Company A, so they have a relationship. Company C is a service provider, so think a Rackspace or an Amazon or somewhere where you could go get a system in the cloud to do whatever you need to with. And then in this case, the attacker is a targeted persistent attacker. And in this case, I'm going to say that this is a professional that's associated with a state-run intelligence organization. So this is a state-sponsored spy. This person's a regular human being. They work regular hours. They're good at some things. They're not so good at other things. Sometimes they fat finger commands, which is kind of funny sometimes when you see, especially when they don't realize they're on a Linux system. They think they're on a Windows system. They keep trying to run Windows commands. So they have their foibles just like all of us. But they're a cog in the intelligence apparatus of their particular nation. There's a talk I saw at DEF CON a couple years ago. It was on DEF CON 17, presented by iDefense, on how the PLA developed their cyber warfare capability. I think the slides are online. If you want to learn more about kind of how does a nation state build up this capability, it's an interesting talk. So to set this up, on day one, the attacker's already been inside Company B. So he's been reading their email. He's got access to their environment. And he's also set up the hop point infrastructure. So he's already got an infrastructure to receive the phone homes from the backdoors that he's going to deploy. So the initial reconnaissance is going to look something like, okay, he's in Company B. He is looking for this widget. He's going to find out, okay, you make this widget in your Chicago plant. So the data he wants is probably going to be in Chicago. And he's going to also think about, how can I best get in? Who's going to click on a link in a phishing email? So he knows that Company B sales guys talk to the procurement guy here at your company, and so that's going to increase the chance that he's going to click that attachment. So he sends a spear phishing campaign with emails to just a handful of your employees, and it turns out Bob here in procurement opens the attachment, and that is the initial compromise. When he opens that attachment, it's going to exploit, for argument's sake, a flash vulnerability, and it's not a 0-day. It's maybe 3 or 4 months old, so attacker's not having to show his hand and use up a 0-day. And this is going to install a backdoor on Bob's workstation. So this is the established foothold. For this case study, let's say that this backdoor is a memory resident poison ivy backdoor. Sometimes it's persistent, sometimes it's not. But the bottom line is, by the end of day one, the attacker is able to own Bob's workstation. So this is what's happening on kind of day one of the attack. So this is the initial recon, initial compromise, and established foothold. If you think about what just happened, and so he owns Bob's workstation, if you can stop the attack here, that's where you want to get. And the organizations that have been dealing with this for a while, and they've invested a lot of resources in people and in technology, they're able to nip this in the bud here before this loop takes place, which is here's where they're installing additional backdoors that make your life difficult to clean up. Here's where they're stealing data, and here's where they're touching a whole bunch of things in your environment that basically increase your risk as they're poking around. So be thinking about that, because what happens next is what you really want to be able to nip this in the bud before it gets there. So on days 2 through 4, the attacker's already got Bob's PC. He's already got, so Chicago. So your crown jewels are in Chicago. And you segmented that network such that only a few engineers that really have access to this information can actually access the crown jewel. So Bob can't connect straight to that. The attacker doesn't know this yet, but he's about to figure it out. So the attacker is going to perform some internal reconnaissance. And one of the first ways he's going to do this is you're going to query Active Directory for a user and computer listing. I want a user listing because I want to know who the domain admins are, and I also want to know who are the admins within the organizational units in Chicago. So if I can get a password to one of those, then that puts me a step closer to getting what I need that's in Chicago. Next, the attacker is going to escalate his privileges on Bob's workstation by using Windows Credential Editor. We still see old legacy PW dump. We still see GSEC dump. Not everybody's using the latest and greatest, but let's say he uses WC. And he obtains the local admin password to Bob's system. So now he's got a computer listing that tells him who the domain admins are, where their computer names are, and he's got local admin password. Local admin password, as in many organizations that I work with, is the same, at least on a large swath of systems in the environment. So he's going to move laterally. He's going to connect to the IT admin PC using the local admin password, and he's going to start looking around for getting domain admin credentials. So it may not be one step, I'm simplifying it here, but he'll start hitting admin workstations with legitimate credentials, with local admin, and using WCE to obtain hashes. Okay, now he's got the domain admin hash, so he's going to go back to AD, and he's going to dump all the user's password hashes out of your Active Directory. This is where things get really gnarly from a remediation perspective, because now the attacker has all these passwords, and in the end, if you don't change them all they have to do is phish one user, pop up in your environment, and then they can use any of these passwords to move laterally immediately, and you're back to not having a good day. So now the attacker's got domain admin. Time to do some internal recon. Oh, but actually, no, first let's do a little leave behind to maintain presence. So we said he was accessing this system through a poison ivy backdoor in memory, so it's not persistent. It's going to go away. So here he's going to drop, this system may be totally random, but he'll drop a different backdoor, say some custom backdoor that he wrote that he rarely uses. It uses a different command and control structure, so it's beaconing out to this other domain name. Just as an insurance policy, ace in the hole in case you find out about his first backdoor. Then the attacker is going to connect to an engineer's workstation in Chicago, because he's got this computer listing and he knows who are the users in the OU in Chicago, Chicago-engineering-file share C drive or F drive or whatever. The way we name things makes it pretty easy for the adversary. So he's going to poke around this system and he's going to read documentation to figure out what's going on, how am I going to be able to connect, where's the data I'm looking for. Different ways they do this. Some attackers are very sophisticated and they'll grab a directory listing, go away for a few days, come back and grab a specific file to look at. Other attackers will literally vacuum up entire file shares worth of information and create 40 gigabyte RAR archives and steal that. So he determines that Alice is one of the engineers on the core team. Alice has access to the crown jewels. He's going to connect to Alice's system using her password because he has it from AD. Then using her system, he's going to pivot through there, connect to the server, pull back the engineering data, and then encrypt it into RAR archives. They don't always encrypt, but a lot of times they'll encrypt the data that they steal to make it more difficult for you to figure out what the heck was stolen. And if you don't get that password, it can be difficult for you. So in a nutshell, within the period of a couple of days, the attacker has gotten what he came for. Stole it from the environment, and you probably have no idea. So that's the escalate privileges, this loop here, and then complete mission. And then maintain presence, he's still got that going on, so he still has access to your environment. So a couple of takeaways from this. One is that the organization was targeted for a reason. They didn't just happen to find that your website was SQL injectable. They are looking for the information on this widget. How do you win? Make the attacker's job more difficult, and think about it from the perspective of you're inhibiting him. You're not going to be able to stop the attacker from getting a foothold, not realistically. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do that. But make their job more difficult, and then improve your capability to detect and identify anomalies. The expanded version of this that I do with my clients, we actually break down each of those stages in great detail and talk about what exactly the attacker's doing, what can you do to inhibit, detect, and respond. And if you think about it that way, you can really come up with some good countermeasures that really move the ball forward. And then you want to enhance your response capabilities because you want to be able to investigate and remediate in months. I'm sorry, not in months, hours and years. And a lot of the clients that I work with, especially with the state-sponsored threats, even if you're notified by the FBI about a particular threat, more often than not, there's more than one group in the environment. So there's distinct groups of individuals within different teams. And usually they've been in the environment for much longer than you know of. So the recommended approach, what next? The attacker TTPs, and so that's the attacker's modus operandi, the toolkit, the procedures, the tactics, the malware that they use, has to drive your remediation approach if you're to maximize your chances of success. So the attacker established a foothold, and they have capability to move laterally within your environment using legitimate accounts. Remediation, you need to isolate the environment. So you need to make it so that the fact that they've established footholds does them no good because they can't get to those footholds. You do this so that while you're in the middle of remediating, they're not in there moving the chairs around on you and installing new backdoors and basically wasting all of the effort that you put into the remediation process. The attacker has methods of evading detection using different types of malware, different command and control infrastructure. So you want to execute your contain, eradicate activities over a short time period. It's not a wise strategy to say, I'm going to remediate this intrusion over the next 6 months, because the attacker is going to be in your environment maneuvering around and basically thwarting your every move, and you might as well wait until you can actually pull the trigger and do it all at once. The attacker's got specific malware and tools that they've deployed, and they have specific command and control networks. You're never going to know them all, but you need to block the ones that you know of and implement a rapid alerting mechanism so that the next time anybody in your environment resolves the domain toocool.3322.org, you get an alert and you're on it right away, because that's your indication that the attacker is probably back if we're talking post-remediation. Also, you want to inhibit the attacker and improve his ability to detect future attacker activities, and I have some specifics on that coming up. The attacker is going to try to keep compromising your environment, so that's one thing to keep in mind, and it's especially if you're on the security team during an intrusion like this, make sure that the executives understand this is not just going to be over. This is a new normal that you're always going to have to be dealing with. So very important, and I'm not focusing on it here, and it's a huge topic in and of itself. You need to conduct an investigation to fully scope the compromise. So you need to understand everything that the attackers install backdoors on so you can fix those. You need to understand what they accessed, what they stole, and that's a whole process that I'm not going to get into. So remediation phases. If you think back to the NIST 861 approach to incident response, to me, remediation encompasses the containment, eradication, and recovery phases all within this remediation event. So this is a short period of time, usually over a weekend, where the organization is going to contain the threat and eliminate it from the environment and begin recovery all at once. And the event is preceded by posturing, and it's followed by strategic measures that are going to help the organization be more resilient in the future. So what does a remediation event look like? So here's a list of activities that comprise a typical remediation event. And I want to caveat before I show this that it's not one size fits all. So don't just take this and say, if you have an incident tomorrow, this is what Mandiant says we should do. This has to be tailored to your organization. And usually when I'm doing an intrusion investigation, I have one person full-time on the team that's dedicated to working with that organization on remediation and on that plan. It's really a full-time job. So the first thing you want to do is you want to temporarily isolate the WAN from the internet. You want to do this so that the attacker's not mucking about in your environment while you're trying to pull systems offline. Because if they're really into you and they're really active in your environment, they'll notice and they will absolutely use a backdoor that you haven't pulled offline yet and install 10 additional backdoors on other systems. Then you have to go investigate those and you get into whack-a-mole at that point. Permanently, so from this day forward, you want to block all the C2 domains and IPs. You want to replace the compromised systems. Typically, you don't want to try and remove the malware, although you can do it on a one-off basis, but generally it's safer to just plan on rebuilding those systems. You want to reset passwords. Usually this is where people in the room start to gasp and shake their heads and shake their fists at me. Yes, that means if they compromised AD, that means you have to reset them all. You want to implement technical countermeasures that directly address the attack lifecycle. So this isn't the time to think about all the security initiatives that you've been thinking about doing that really don't do much. We'll talk about that some more. You want to validate that everything that you've done above has been implemented correctly. IT environments are complex, people make mistakes, and you don't want to get to the end of the remediation event and find out, oops, we forgot to pull these systems offline. And so what you'll see in basically this approach is a belt and suspenders approach that tries to minimize the risk of a piece of one of these components failing. So if you do miss a system, you're going to have blocked the known domains in the C2 infrastructure, so you should be able to figure that out quickly. And then you want to reconnect the internet. So typically, most organizations I work with start this Friday night and they end usually by Sunday morning. So remediation, we talked about posturing a little bit, and I'll have more details on this later. And then the strategic initiatives are really not tactically necessary for remediation, but this is what's going to really show that you've learned something as an organization from this pain that you've been through and do better next time, because that's really all you can hope for, because there will be a next time. A couple of caveats on this approach, because I know some of you are probably thinking this, and I get this almost every client that I work with, is how can you stand up there and say we have to let the attacker stay active in our environment while we do nothing? I've had people disagree with me so vehemently to the point that their face turned red and they pounded their fist on the table. It's my personal, professional opinion, you cannot do this. Here's why. And there are some situations where it's appropriate to take action. But what you have to think about is, think about the worst case scenario. So let's contain right now. Let's pull those systems offline. The attacker may completely change their TCPs. And if the impact of the intruder's activities is severe enough, that may be reasonable for you. And I have two examples on the next slide to show that. But is that worth it to you? And realize that may set your investigation back. You may have to basically start from scratch because now the attacker's doing something different that you don't know about. And also, consider whether the attacker cares about persistence. So, for example, if if you're a bank and you know they're in your system stealing your money right now, just cut them off. There's that type of attacker is not typically wanting to stick around. So 2 caveats. So the financial breach. Generally, when I respond to that sort of event, then yes, you want to implement immediate containment. Find out what backdoors they're using, what command and control infrastructure, and start fighting them immediately to limit the spread, limit the impact of their activities. And then the second example I have is a little bit different, where say that you make the widget in Chicago, and that's all you guys make. You're a supplier in the aerospace and defense industry or something like that, and you make this one little widget that they use, and if you lose that and somebody else starts making it, then you're out of luck. So in that case, I would probably say, you know what, it's reasonable to contain that, but try to just partially contain it. Try to pull that system offline, enclave it, or something, and try to minimize the disruption to the attacker until you can fully scope it. Prioritizing initiatives. This is an important theme because I think if I were to ask a question, how do we best limit the attacker from moving laterally? All of you would probably raise your hands because we're mostly security professionals and this is what we do and we're all super opinionated. So prioritizing initiatives when you have limited time, limited resources. If you picture this, your company's been notified by the FBI, you're working long days, you're working nights, you're working weekends, and you're stressed out, and you're trying to investigate this compromise, you're short-staffed, and then you have to figure out all those. So you have to be able to prepare that remediation event within the span of, say, a month average, month to 6 weeks. This is not the time to be having a 45-minute conversation on, do I want to have NTLM v2 authentication required in Windows, or do I want to fall back to v1, or things that are really not super relevant to exactly what the attackers are doing in their TTPs. So I use this as a conversation piece to work with clients to explain to them the relative value of different recommendations. And so you've got your attack lifecycle across the top. You've got your capabilities of inhibit, detect, and respond down the side here. And then across the bottom, you've got your constraints. And this is one of the reasons why I say it's not one size fits all. Something that, and I have some more specific examples in my white paper that, associated with this talk. But if you don't have great threat intelligence and you have poor visibility, then you're going to react differently than if you've got a 24/7 SOC and you've got some former military folks that are maybe very experienced in dealing with this threat. And I'm also not saying you want to check the box on every one of these. Trying to detect the initial compromise or complete mission. If I had a solution for that, I'd be a billionaire and I probably wouldn't be standing here. So it's not always worth it, but this is the way you should think about it to get the most bang for your buck from scarce resources. So next I'm going to go into a couple of really specific recommendations that typically form the core parts of the posturing. So I already talked about the remediation event. I want to talk about posturing. So this is the phase where you have an investigation going on, because incident response is really investigation plus remediation. It's not one or the other. So you've got your investigation going on, and while that's going on, you need to be ready to pull the plug on on the attacker over the span of a weekend in about a month. So everything you're focused on is geared towards that. So plan the remediation work stream. So you want to assign and empower a remediation lead. This is going to be the person that's going to marshal everybody together, define work streams, keep everybody moving, and it's really a full-time job. You want to brief senior management, and you want them to buy into this whole effort because it's going to require reprioritizing some initiatives. If you've got things on people's plates that are less important than resolving this incident and the remediation, then some choices are going to have to be made. You want to create a project plan that basically works backwards from the remediation event, that kind of as I outlined it in those 9 or 10 steps. And you want to blow out the detailed plans and start turning it into a project where you have people figuring out how they're going to do the password reset, for example. You want to assign accountability deadlines, and you may have to reprioritize initiatives. Second key thing after you've kicked off your remediation effort, you want to enhance logging and monitoring, because if you haven't dealt with a targeted attack before, average organization, you're probably not doing everything you could in terms of logging and monitoring. And so your first concern is, even prior to remediation, there are certain things you need to do to facilitate the investigation team's efforts so that they can figure out what the heck happened, to find the back doors, and understand what was lost. Some high priority logs. Some of you, when I show these, you're going to shake your head and think, well, I thought everybody had that. No, they don't. I'm here to tell you. DHCP logs. If your investigation team comes to you and says, hey, we have this, there was an event that we're following up on, there was some backdoor traffic that we saw last week, this was the IP address. If it was a DHCP leased address, you absolutely need to be able to resolve that to a host name, and you need to be able to do it within some reasonable amount of time, i.e. not weeks. DNS queries. If the FBI comes to your door and tells you that you had systems that were compromised by a state-sponsored adversary 8 months ago, they've just got around to telling you now, and it was beaconing to toocool.332.org. Wouldn't it be great if you had DNS logs where you could go back and say, whoever resolved that, tell me. Of course, then you may need DHCP logs if those give you addresses that were dynamic. So you got to have these, and it's a great way to identify compromised systems. Windows AD logs, and really authentication-related events in general. This can really help you investigate and understand lateral movement because, as I showed in the case study, the attacker's typically going to be moving laterally by using accounts that they've stolen while in your environment. And so the way you track them, there's a couple ways. You can look for host-based indicators. So in other words, try to find the fingerprints of the particular tool, the backdoor, for example, that they installed. But keep in mind, I gave a statistic earlier where the company had 100,000 systems or so, and they had 30 systems that were infected. Well, the attacker touched around 1,000 systems looking for data and dumping passwords. So in that case, if you really want to understand the scope, you can't just look for the malware because that doesn't tell the whole story. You need to actually understand what the human adversary did in your network. And one of the great ways to do that is if you have these logs. I did a small project with a software company a couple weeks ago, showed up on site. They had an awesome Splunk instance. Within a couple minutes of my being there, I was running queries for Kerberos service tickets related to an account that we knew was compromised, and it just basically walked you through the map of how they use this account to move across the network. Firewall logs, so talking about egress traffic, being able to tell me as an investigator that you had a bunch of denied traffic from IPs in whatever country doesn't really do me any good. I want to know what got out and where did it go. VPN authentication, I think we've blogged or talked about this in white papers previously at Mandy, but some attackers really like to get into that VPN space, so they'll start using VPN as a means to maintain presence in your environment. So you want to know who's authenticating your network. You want to get logs such that you can look for anomalies. Then, as important as collecting these logs, and I can't stress this enough, you need to have a process to rapidly query this data to support ad hoc requests. So when the investigation team comes to you and says, I need to know everybody that resolved toocool.332.org, and I need to know it regularly, I need this data every day. If it takes them 6 weeks to get you that information, that's a fail, and that's something that you need to fix. Also, you can implement alerts to identify known attacker activity. So this domain name that you know is bad, create an alert and get an alert every time that occurs, and have somebody correlate that every day, twice a day, with the systems that you know are infected. And that way you're cross-checking the information from multiple sources, and you might find something that you didn't know. The 800-pound gorilla, the password change. This is typically the item that causes most of my clients the most pain. And this is because obviously you don't want to disrupt the business, because if you're a manufacturing company, like in my example, and you impact the shipment process to your customers, then you might as well go out of business because you're going to lose a bunch of money. So you don't want to do that. So in order not to disrupt the business, you need to figure out how you're going to change service account passwords that run those applications out in your wherever in your business. That takes time and effort, and it's not easy. You want to figure out how you're going to make local admin passwords unique. Before I got into incident response, I did a lot of penetration testing, and it always surprised me that the people would have the same local admin password everywhere, and it hasn't changed. So if you still have the same local admin passwords on all of the systems in your environment, or maybe just on your workstations, put that on your list. Write your boss an email with your plan on how you're going to fix that when you walk out of here, because that's really important, and that is one of the big ways that the attackers are moving laterally. You want to develop a plan for resetting all the application accounts. That's typically a pain. And you want to figure out how exactly you're going to do this, and then you want to try and do a dry run of maybe testing it on a few accounts. Focus on the most impactful defensive measures. So if you go back to that remediation planning matrix and think about what can I do to inhibit, detect, and respond more effectively to those particular activities that the attacker is going to be coming at me with, you want to do what's going to be most impactful because you're short on time, you're short on resources, and you need to get this all ready to go in a month to 2 months. Application whitelisting on your Active Directory servers. The password change is painful. So you may look at this and say, well, but we have 80 domain controllers, and it's going to be really expensive to put app whitelisting on all of those. Well, guess what? If you have to go through an enterprise password change and you go through that pain, you're probably going to come out of that wishing or wanting to put whitelisting on DCs. That way, it helps. Even if the attacker's got admin privileges, it reduces the chance that they'll be able to execute their password dumper. Plus, it gives you a really high-quality alert that, weird service was denied running on domain controller, and then that's something you can immediately figure out how did that get on the domain controller. Block workstation to workstation traffic. Why should my PC be able to communicate to your PC in the environment? Typically, nothing good is going to come of that. This is where your host-based firewalls, some HIPS products can help with this, with appropriate whitelists for help desk and your management tools. Two-factor authentication for remote access. If you don't have two-factor authentication for remote access, put that on your top 3 list. You need to get that fixed. If a targeted attacker gets into your environment and they get usernames and passwords, they're going to be able to access your environment remotely. They won't even need to deploy backdoors because you've already given them a backdoor by not requiring two-factor. Even if you think you have two-factor, go back and actually put eyeballs on all the accounts on that list and make sure there's not exceptions, because I've seen that before where everybody thinks everybody has two-factor authentication except for there's those 10 accounts that don't have it because, well, those are the 10 that the attacker is going to gravitate towards. You want to patch third-party applications such as Java, Flash, the Office products. These constitute the attack surface for this type of attack. So it's the perimeter is a lot less relevant. It's really this perimeter, which is what's going to get exploited when a user receives an email or goes to a website, as well as browsers. That's going to help them. That's going to raise the bar on them getting back in. You want to reduce the number of accounts with elevated privileges on their workstations. I throw this out there as a posturing item. Very few companies that I work with are able to make much headway on this because it typically takes a lot of work and is usually a year, 2-year initiative, take away local admin. But if your users don't have local admin, it really limits the impact of that initial compromised established foothold because it limits what the attacker can do in terms of escalating privileges. Strategic. So this is after you're through the remediation event. From an organizational perspective, you want to make sure that you maintain the momentum. It's all too easy. You've had this period of a couple months of intense activity to just everybody goes home and you're not done yet because in the new normal, this is going to happen again and you need to be ready for when the attackers return. So the most important thing you can do from a long-term perspective is invest in people. The next item I'm going to talk about some technology, a recommendation that has some technology components, but people are the most important thing because, at least for me and in my experience, if I had a choice between having the latest whiz-bang tool or having a really smart team member that I could sit in a room with and figure stuff out, I would always choose to have the smart team member because if you have smart people, you can figure anything out and get it done and string together solutions that get things done. One of the clients I worked with last year, we made this recommendation on the DHCP logs, and they didn't have a real good way to do it easily. They had some really smart folks on their IR team, and they brought in they whipped up some scripts on a Linux box and MySQL database and basically swept the network a couple times a day, getting IP addresses, put them in database. Was it crude? Yes, but it got the job done, and it got us the data that we need. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that your organization has personnel dedicated to hunting. And this is, even if you're a relatively small organization, you need to have somebody who at least part-time is doing this. If you're real small, maybe you want to look to a third party to do that, but you need to have somebody to perform the security intelligence function. So this is integrating intelligence into your operations and actually going hunting. So I don't mean sitting in front of a console and clicking through ArcSight alerts and then not doing anything. This is something really, you need to have somebody who's got experience with targeted threats, who understands what to look for and can really go out and look in the nooks and crannies of your environment. You may have to look outside the organization. A lot of the bigger companies that I work with have a culture that very much is kind of promoting from within. This is something where if you don't have the expertise in-house, you may want to consider bringing in somebody, hiring somebody onto your team that can be a catalyst that can bring people up to speed on those skills. Then you don't want this team to just kind of be a lame duck team that clicks buttons and generates reports. You really want them to have the buy-in from the business that they need in order to be successful. So you need to get executive buy-in. Make sure that when they generate an alert or when they say, hey, we need to pull this system offline because it's infected and we don't want the attacker to spread, you need the buy-in so that somebody has a hammer that they can drop and just make that happen. Otherwise, you're not going to be successful. If you have to have a meeting, we had one I was working on recently, there was related to the PC rebuilds, there was a meeting that had, I forget exactly how many, but it was over 40 people had to dial into this call. Not effective. You need to have the hammer. Second, and very important, this may be the last one that I have time to talk about because I want to have 10 minutes for questions. You want to create an investigation-ready environment. So this means, even if you think about this, if you've never gone through a targeted intrusion in your organization, think about that attack lifecycle and the case study that I went through and figure out where are you today, how would you be able to detect, respond, and inhibit, more detect and respond when we're talking about investigation, but how would that work out for you today? And if you have gaps, start fixing them. You want to formalize an incident response plan, and you don't want to have a plan that's real rigid. You want to have a plan that basically facilitates and enables smart people to do good work. You want to make sure that you involve business stakeholders, so don't develop this plan in a vacuum. Worked with an organization this last year on formalizing their IR plan, and we actually went to all the business units. We sat down. What are your concerns? When we talk about formalizing incident response, what's your take on this? And we work with them throughout the process. And at the end, it was actually kind of neat to see the CIO basically put everybody on the spot, went down the list of the business units and said, do you agree with this and will you support it? Do you agree with this? You know, speak now or forever hold your peace. And that was pretty cool because the business was really getting involved. You want to define playbooks for the common response scenarios. So for example, you see a system beaconing to a known malicious domain, you think it's targeted, what do you do? Figure out what that looks like, and that'll help you determine if you have the right tools and processes in place. Then you want to define meaningful outcome-based metrics. So it doesn't do you much good to say we had the firewall denied 8,642 events today. What you really want to focus on is the outcome. So we had a targeted attack that the attacker got into the environment through spear phishing on X time, and we detected it, investigated it, and contained the threat at Y time, and look at the difference between those two times, and that's your mean time to remediate, and that can help both demonstrate the value of the resources that your company is investing into security, into these processes, as well as really help you show and get a handle that you're actually doing better or not. You want to improve visibility. So this is probably going to require technology investment. You want to aggregate logs centrally. So what's a good example of that I can use? It's not good enough to have the information logged on systems across the environment if you can't query it and say, hey, I want to see all the Kerberos service tickets related to the John Doe account between this date and this date to see what systems were accessed. And then you need to actually use that information and tune it to limit the amount of false positives and also reduce the amount of data that you're going to have to store and maintain. And then threat intelligence is also very important in terms of understanding the threats that are targeting companies in your industry, sharing information with peers. Several industries have information sharing frameworks and organizations that share threat intelligence that are outside of the government. So I know the Defense Industrial Base has Defense Security Information Exchange. The financial industry, I forget the name of that one, and the pharma industry has one as well. Also, conduct tabletop exercises. If you've never gone through something like what I just described before, run a tabletop exercise where you take that case study and start going through it and figure out, well, if the FBI came to it, well, what would we do if we got notified that we had a breach? How would we determine lateral movement? Do we have those logs? And then improve your process. One more. So enhance authentication and authorization. So long term, you really need to think about reducing the number of privileged accounts in your environment. Also, there's obviously going to be places that privileged accounts are required, and nothing that I'm saying up here is black and white. There's all these shades of gray. If you have privileged accounts that are required, then reduce their scope of authority. So if you have a service account that has to run as a domain admin, hopefully you don't, but say it has to run on certain systems, well then use Active Directory to configure that account can only be used from certain systems or for certain types of logons. So for example, if you have a service account that's required to run a service, why the heck would somebody need to authenticate to a server with remote desktop with that account? That should just be prohibited right off the bat. That's what I just said. Also, longer term, implementing whitelisting on key user workstations. So admin PCs. Also, Password vaulting software can really give you a leg up and help you do a password change should you need to, and also helps facilitate good password management practices. So I'm at about 10 minutes and 30 seconds to go, so I'm going to jump through this last one. So in summary, I outlined what is a targeted persistent threat. We talked a little bit about how that is different from automated threats of the past, fighting the configure or NIMDA worm. The attackers are going to return, so you should plan countermeasures that are going to address the attack lifecycle and use this information to really build security that works rather than checking the box on things that just look good on paper. So with that, I wanted to remind everyone, please fill out the survey forms so that we can get some feedback from you on what you thought about this talk. I'm going to take questions now for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have to end in here. If you've got additional questions for me, or you want to hang out, we've got Mandian has the Trevi room on the promenade level. We've got a bar, so we've got beer, we've got refreshments. So if you want to come by, feel free, and I'll take questions for the next 9.5 minutes if anybody has them. Yes. So his question was, I want enterprises to have hunters. Are there enough hunters to go around? No, there's not. It's tough to find people. I mean, we're looking for people too, within my company, and we do a lot of hunting on a daily basis, and it's a particular mix of skills that you need, skills and backgrounds, but it's something that I think that people from all walks of life within the IT and security fields can get into. Because I think everybody in this room probably has some foundational knowledge that's relevant. It's just getting an understanding of the specific techniques and understanding more about investigative tools and having a multidisciplinary approach to your team with somebody who knows how to hunt. So not enough to go around. Any additional questions? Does anybody know if we have a microphone that we could share around? I guess not. Sure. Yep. So the question was, how much of a concern would it be as you're planning a remediation and the attacker's in your environment with the attacker getting wind of the plan as it goes back and forth via email? My answer, it depends on the activity that the group is actually doing in your environment. So not all attackers that I've responded to read email. Some of them do, and some of them that's the main thing that they're trying to get. If they're not in your email, I would say it's maybe a lower risk, but I would advise you to encrypt your emails or use an out-of-band communication mechanism if you're really concerned. I've had clients that actually stood up, basically subscribed to I don't know what you call it, basically a third-party site that it was a hosted SharePoint with hosted email with encryption, and we used completely out-of-band communications for that. So it's something to think about. It depends on the attacker, but I would encrypt stuff. Yes?
Will this go on if I just, I don't know.
Okay, so the question was, one of the steps that I recommended for containment was to disconnect the network from the internet. How successful is that? That's one that when I say that to my clients on day one, you get a groan, and sometimes they're just pounding their fist. But most of the clients that I've worked with have in some way, shape, or form done that. It's not always a full disconnection. Like in some cases, I've seen where if the compromised infected systems are in a particular location, they'll block egress from that location, and they've been successful with that. It really depends, but you want to try and block as much egress traffic as you can. Now, no, I'm not saying block inbound. So for example, if you're 24/7, 365 and you have applications that need to be customer facing, leave those up, that's fine. Just make sure that the internal systems are not going to be able to just initiate traffic out. And that's important because you don't want the attacker to be able to come back in through a back door while you're remediating. So I've seen it be more successful than you would think. Yes.
When you block spear phishing, since you block it so quickly, if you're successful, can you tell whether or not that's a targeted attack spearfish or whether that is a commodity spearfish?
Without specific intelligence related to those threats, it's difficult to determine that. One of the ways that you can determine, that you can get an idea is if you analyze the malware that it drops and the command and control infrastructure it communicates with, if it's a backdoor, if it's something that is definitely bad and there's nothing written about it in the public domain, so domains, you Google it, domains not coming up, nothing related to this tool's coming up, then it is more likely that it's something targeted, but it's not foolproof.
And then would that change your behavior at all in your response in terms of, hey, you have a good feeling that this is a targeted attack?
Absolutely. If it's something that seems like it's more commodity, then the approach, I definitely wouldn't wait. I mean, if it's commodity, like if it's something that looks like a botnet, generally when I'm doing an investigation, I'll report that to my clients every day, and they can just advise them to deal with it through their normal process. So.
Thank you.
Yes. I believe so. I haven't actually looked at it yet, but I submitted it, so. Sure. Me too. So the question was, could I beat the drum more on whitelisting? I practice what I preach. I run it on my system. I think it's a great tool. I really can't say enough good about it. Now, implementing it enterprise-wide across the end-user environment, I think, is going to be complicated. And honestly, I don't see that many organizations doing that. But critical servers, domain controllers, think about anywhere that if the attacker got admin access and ran a password hash dumper, where could they get the most password hashes from? Active Directory servers / domain controllers, Exchange servers where you got a bunch of users logged in, file servers where you've got 1,000 users from your corporate office logged in and they can get all those hashes. That's going to be where you get the biggest bang for your buck. So. Yes. How common am I seeing whitelisting today? Across servers and workstations, I'm not seeing it very widely at all. Some organizations that I've worked with are starting to implement that as part of their next generation builds, starting with admin users or more users that perform sensitive tasks. Across servers, I wouldn't say that it's widespread at all. I can say, though, that the clients that I've seen implement it on their domain controllers, like I suggested, I've seen cases where they did successfully thwart password hash dumping the next time around, which if it can save you having to do a password reset, it's paid, in my view, it's paid for itself. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious about log aggregation, collection, and what kind of tools you recommend, or what you've seen in terms of results. I'm wondering if the SIM tools are really adequate, or if you're looking at more like tools like Splunk, some of the newer tools.
So what I'd say about that is the most important thing to do, to think about first, is the ability to aggregate logs and to search them for kind of the purposes that I outlined here, rather than a lot of the SIM functionality with the correlation. It's nice, but I would think about that after you've already tackled aggregation. What you want to avoid is, I had one this past year where they have logs, and they're pretty good logs, except for that they're on thousands of servers, archived locally, and whenever I asked them a question, we'd have to copy logs from 1,000 servers, a couple terabytes of information, to one location, and then I would, then I'm running log parser on that, or I had a little Sawmill instance that I had back in my lab. That's good, Splunk, ArcSight. There's no particular product that I would say is really better or worse. I would just pick one and then really learn how to use it and tune it and make sure it's not something that just sits on the shelf. Yes.
How much log do you guys?
My general recommendation is a year. I feel like a couple of months is probably not enough. A year, in some cases, a year is not enough. I mean, if your earliest state of compromise goes back 2 years, then I'm not going to be able to tell you much of what happened prior to that year. But I feel like a year is a good benchmark. One thing that you can do also as part of the tuning process to pare down the amount of storage that's required is look real hard. So start logging what you think is adequate for your future investigative needs. Tabletop exercise. Make sure that it's actually adequate and that it's answering the right questions. And then look at what else you log that's maybe not as useful, and think about how can you exclude those events from storing it, just to help, because I know storage balloons when you store this stuff long term. Yes.
Yeah. I also wondered about data loss prevention solutions, if any of those have helped people that have had incidents, not to clean it up or anything, but maybe prevent the data from leaking out in the first place.
Right. I don't really believe in DLP. My experience has been with this type of attack, it's not going to really help you at all. In certain circumstances where you're looking for a certain structure of data, like credit card numbers going out in plain text or being stored to a thumb drive or something, then I could see it being helpful in detecting those. But I feel like, whenever I see that those types of solutions talked about, I can always figure out a way around it. So to me, it's not, I don't really think much about it. Yes? I would say it depends on the size of your organization, the type of threats that you face, and I guess overall expertise that you have in the environment. It's hard to say. I think most larger organizations tend to have somewhere around 8 to 12 people dedicated to this kind of hunting function, like global 100 type organizations. If you're a mid-sized or smaller organization, I think you could get away with one person. One person, maybe two people. Really just something that you have to work out. I don't really have a great answer. All right, I'm going to take one more question, then I'm getting the hook here. Yes? So the question was, how much of this issue does internal two-factor authentication solve? I like internal two-factor authentication when you build an infrastructure where it was that last slide that I skipped through. You segment the network, and you've got your really most critical, no kidding, we're going to lose the business if we lose this data. Segment that, require users, if possible, to use virtual desktop interface to get access to that, require admins to go through a jump server, and then only allow connections from the VDI or from the jump server, and then require two-factor to that jump server. But at the same time, I know from experience that if the attacker gets the hash, that a lot of times, even if you're using a two-factor solution, that with that hash, you can still pass the hash. So it's not as wonderful of a solution as I would hope. But I do think it raises the bar in conjunction with other architecture components. Okay, I'm sorry, folks. I'm out of time. If anybody has any additional questions or wants to hang out, please come to Trevi.